I think what I'd firstly like to say is obviously the title of this talk, ocean plastic pollution, a convenient but distracting truth. We'll get on to why that is the title in the first place. But I think scenes like this from the beaches in the UK are pretty common sights. And in other parts of the world, we have different types of plastic pollution, in some cases much more severe as well than we do in the UK. So I don't want to get across the idea that plastic isn't a problem. Plastic is a problem, but the question that really we need to think about is, it needs to be addressed, but how does it need to be addressed, and how severe is that threat from plastic? So I'm going to start off by looking at the planetary boundary concept from the Stockholm Resilience Centre, and that kind of looks at the major environmental issues which we face today. So this dotted line around the green here is basically our safe operating space for the Earth. And when anything on this graph it goes past that dotted line, then we've exceeded planetary boundaries. So we can see, for example, pollution in terms of nitrates and phosphates have really exceeded the planetary boundaries. We've got far too much nitrate and phosphate on the Earth at the moment, going into the natural environment, mainly through things like fertilizer. But there's two core planetary boundaries as well, and they are biodiversity loss, which is really a combination of this biosphere integrity and land system change. So both of them exceeding planetary boundaries. We're losing biodiversity at a huge, unprecedented rate. And while it doesn't look so severe, climate change as well. But these are the core planetary boundaries, and they're the really important ones, because if we exceed these by too much or for too long, we can actually shift the Earth from one stable state to another. An example of that would be things like melting the Siberian permafrost, for example. Once we do that through climate change, we release methane into the atmosphere, which further exacerbates climate change. Or if the polar ice caps melt, we'll be changing the reflectance of the Earth, so it'll actually absorb more heat, again causing more climate change. So we need to be really especially careful with these two. There has been talk about plastic being a planetary boundary, and arguably perhaps it should, but it's not going to be a core planetary boundary. And the key threats which I think we really face are biodiversity loss and climate change, and this is both applied to the ocean and to terrestrial realm. And if we look at plastics, well, we do know that plastic kills individual animals. There's no doubt about that. We've got huge amounts of evidence. So we see birds, fish, cetaceans all washed up. Their stomachs are full of plastic. They've been unable to eat. It's definitely killing individual animals. But at a population level, there's actually not that much evidence of the effects of plastic. So there is some evidence that juvenile coastal birds, certain species of juvenile coastal birds actually are surviving slightly less as a result of plastic pollution, but there isn't a lot of evidence. That doesn't mean more evidence might not arrive in the future, but there isn't much evidence at the moment. And what evidence we do have is relatively small in magnitude for the population level effects of plastic pollution. And also, if we look at toxicity, so the actual studies which have been done on the amount of on how toxic plastic is, there's limited toxicity in the plastic that's actually entering the rivers and the oceans. And part of that was what we put together, myself and Peter Jones from UCL, in this paper from 2019. And again, we do say, well, plastic is an important issue, but it's really not the biggest issue facing our planet or oceans. That's really biodiversity loss and climate change, however they're caused. And I think there'll be talks about that later. But we also look at something we call plastic distraction. And that's the role of ineffective measures to reduce the amount of plastic, which is one problem, but also the risk of focusing so much on that we actually ignore other environmental threats as well. And I guess the best example of that is things like reusable coffee cups. It I don't think it's going to come to any surprise to the audience here if I say reusable coffee cups are not going to save the planet. Buying a reusable coffee cup is not your solution to solving every environmental issue which is going, but somehow that's how they appear to be marketed to us. And in actual fact, the cost of manufacture of these things is really high in terms of resources. And if you don't use a reusable coffee cup multiple times, for literally sort of constantly for a couple of months, you're actually putting more plastic or using more natural resources into the environment than you would be if you were using disposable ones. And even if everybody had a reusable coffee cup, the proportion of plastic use to be reduced is relatively small. And actually, if we look at climate change and the actions we were told to combat climate change, I guess in sort of the late 1990s, when we first became aware of it as an issue. Actually, a lot of these sort of consumer-based things or simple lifestyle changes really don't make that much difference. And you can see in this paper from 2017, upgrading your light bulbs in your house doesn't really make much difference. It doesn't not just make a difference at a global level, it actually doesn't make that much difference to your own personal carbon footprint, yet alone collectively what's going on at a global level. Even things like, washing clothes in warm water or doing recycling doesn't make that much change to your personal carbon footprint. And you need these major lifestyle changes, things like, switching to a vegan diet, which is a big sort of change that people have to make, much more than just changing your light bulbs in your house. Not flying, not having a car, and more controversially, and I'll say a little bit more about this, but actually having fewer children. And just to say that though, if you do look at this figure carefully, we do see we've got a logarithmic scale going on here, and actually there's a huge difference. There's sort of a six-fold difference in the carbon footprint of having an extra child from Japan compared to the USA. And obviously these are Western countries, so we really need to focus on reducing the carbon footprint of Western countries. I think is a better take-home message than, thinking overpopulation is the major issue. But this study, which was published in 2019, but actually conducted in 2015, and it was conducted in Queensland in towns along the Great Barrier Reef, looked at what people thought was the biggest environmental issue. Now, I say it was conducted in 2015 because obviously there have been multiple mass bleaching events subsequent to that, but there had been a few bleaching events, but there have been several bleaching events well before 2015 as well. And the biggest environmental threat that people thought faced their local community was actually the amount of rubbish on the beaches, and not to do with coral reefs being in good condition. So at least back in 2015, there was really this huge focus, I think, on plastic pollution as being this major threat. And of course, you can buy your way out of that threat by buying yourself a reusable coffee cup. And I think that narrative has changed, and it really changed partly with this sort of big report from the IPCC on global warming in 2018. And that led to a load of global protests, so Extinction Rebellion, the school strikes, and that really got climate change. And I've got some evidence to show this, really sort of changed people's attitudes to climate change, and really sort of brought that up to the top of the agenda. But a quick question to address really is, if we're going to address environmental problems, climate change, pollution, biodiversity loss, well, what actually works? And we managed to investigate this with a sort of a systems approach for a complex systems model, which I'm not going to go into detail, other than saying we looked overall at environmental breakdown as a sum of biodiversity loss, climate change, and pollution. And that pollution can include plastic pollution. And we can look at policies which would sort of alter that. And the best way of reading this graph is if you're in this blue section, there's probably not a lot of change really going on. So if we look at a basic Green New Deal, and a basic Green New Deal includes those things like switching to renewable energy, retrofitting, insulation of houses, it doesn't make that much, it doesn't have that much benefit for the environment. It's probably better than business as usual. If we carry on as usual, we're going to get worse, but actually it's not going to improve the situation much from where we are now. And what we do need is a comprehensive Green New Deal. And that comprehensive Green New Deal really needs to, it involves the basic components of the Green New Deal, but it also needs to look at pollution taxes, particularly carbon taxes, ending fossil fuel subsidies, reducing resource use, and really investing in nature-based solutions and not just trees. What we find then is that we've massively reduced environmental breakdown, we've reduced pollution, we've increased biodiversity, and we've reduced warming. But there's a political problem here which really needs to be solved, because we're actually not having much effect. Economic growth isn't growing, and that's a political issue which needs to be resolved. We need to change that economic growth paradigm to get this true systems change. A little bit of research I did with Ellie, who was an undergraduate student of mine. This was done just pre-pandemic, so 2019-20. If we looked at what people now thought was, and mainly a UK survey, but what people thought now was probably the biggest environmental threat, we can see that climate change is by far there. And I think that's the reflection of the protests and the IPCC reports and things we've seen in recent years. Although biodiversity loss, which is an equally important threat, isn't necessarily registering with people at the moment. But one of the problems that we have is that when we ask people, what do we do to address environmental issues? What's the most effective issue? We're actually getting things like purchase power coming up as the major issue. People are still thinking you can change what you buy and really affect the way that the environment is being affected. And things like protests and big lifestyle changes like vegan diets score lower. And this is perhaps this legacy of this neoliberal approach we've had, where we've been really advocating market-based solutions to climate change in the 90s, and in the sort of 2010s, we've been really advocating that as a solution to plastic pollution. There is, if we talk about plastic specifically, at least people thinking, more charges on carrier bags and things perhaps isn't the solution. And actually banning, so a legislative approach on single-use plastics has actually come up as the most effective. But this is important because of the concept of spillover. And spillover is an idea from social sciences. And in this case, we can think of it as the concept of one environmental action or one pro-environmental behavior that people are doing, leading to people doing more environmental behaviors. And this research, again from 2019, basically says that, well, in practice, people who do one pro-environmental behavior are actually less likely to go on and do others. And that's important. So if we're getting people to change what they buy, they might be less likely to do other pro-environmental behaviors, which might have a bigger impact. But also the link is strongest when those behaviors which people are doing are similar. So obviously, if you buy a reusable coffee cup, you might go and buy a reusable water bottle. But that's not the same as protesting or voting differently, even to really have a big effect on those environmental issues. And we think that these actions might actually distract. So these simple sort of consumer-based actions, which have been sort of advocated so strongly for plastic, might distract and prevent people taking the real and necessary action to protect the environment. So in conclusion, the solution to all of our environmental threats can be solved really at the same time, and that's what we need to be thinking about. And it involves system change. It involves economic, political, and technological reform. It needs to sway public opinion on these issues. And overall, we just need to reduce the overconsumption of natural resources. And that is the key message that needs to be echoed. We don't need to be pushing a consumer-based approach, and we really shouldn't be really looking at addressing major environmental issues on an issue-by-issue approach. The issues are essentially, or the solution to the issues is essentially the same. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to, in many ways, deal with some of the questions that Rick has so brilliantly addressed, which is to look at plastic in the context of the other ocean threats and see how it can be used possibly to draw the world's attention to the other ocean threats rather than to eclipse those threats. So the first question is, why has plastic captured the public imagination so much, and so much more than these other threats? Just to give a bit of background about the Blue Marine Foundation, because Blue Marine's origins lie in a film called The End of the Line, which came out in 2009 and was in turn based on a book written by Charles Clover, which came out in 2004. And both book and film really addressed what was then a relatively little understood by the kind of wider public issue about overfishing, dramatic loss of both biodiversity and biomass in the sea, and the effect that was having on multiple systems. So overfishing in a sense, so Blue was set up in 2010 off the back of this film, and overfishing is very much in Blue Marine's DNA. It's been our focus for all this time, for the last 12 years, and we've basically set our sights on trying to tackle the issue of overfishing, raise awareness about it, press for more marine protected areas, better marine protected areas, work if possible to support genuine models of sustainable fishing. But about 6 or 7 years ago, when plastic really rose up the agenda, we wondered whether we were somehow missing a trick. And so we re-examined all the threats to ocean health and concluded that plastic, while certainly severe and getting worse for sure, was one of many threats rather than being the main event. Exactly as Rick has said, it needs to be seen in the context of these other threats, all of which in a sense interrelate, and the way that climate change is affecting the ocean through warming and its associated problem of acidification, at the same time overfishing and the reduction of life and habitats in the ocean is reducing the ocean's ability to absorb CO2. And so those two problems very much go hand in hand. And then there are extremely severe threats like bioinvasives and noise pollution, which are given very little airtime relatively, and but have a terrible impact on marine life. Similarly, we had a look at the priority interventions. There are a lot of useful scientific papers on this, of course, including one by Dan LaFoley and many others. 8 urgent, fundamental and simultaneous steps needed to restore ocean health. And again, plastic is obviously part of that, but one of many. So we concluded at Blue Marine that our focus should continue to be really on what we're taking out of the ocean, all of these issues around illegal fishing and mismanagement of the ocean and massive over extraction of biomass beyond scientific advice, rather than what we're putting in, which of course other NGOs are handling brilliantly and very ably. One aspect of plastic that we do still cover at Blue Marine is around ghost fishing gear, because a lot of it is made of plastic, and its impact on marine life is horrific. Around, the figures slightly vary on this, but around 10% of macroplastic in the ocean is made up of fishing gear abandoned or just lost fishing gear. But it's possible that that 10% kills 4 times as much marine life as the other 90%, because of course it's designed for the purpose. And you often get these situations because it's made of this very durable plastic material that a net can capture a huge amount of marine life. Eventually, the dead weight of the life makes it sink to the bottom. It then rots, floats up again, and begins its ghastly process all over again. So that is something that we we do include in our remit. But we continue to ask ourselves why plastic has captured the public imagination more than anything else. Why, if you ask the general public as opposed to scientists what they believe that the greatest threats to the ocean are and what the main interventions should be, that they will invariably say plastic. One thing I think about why it's the case is because of the visuals, the way that plastic looks when it's in the ocean is so unbelievably shocking. And sorry if you're trying to have your breakfast and I have shown the image that I'm sure we've all seen of the poor turtle with the straw up its nose, and hopefully that meant that anyone who saw that image would never use a straw again, as people probably shouldn't if they're over the age of 5. I think it's something to do with the fact that plastic in the context of nature is incredibly out of place and therefore very arresting as an image. I think there's also a sense that people might have a personal, feel a more personal connection with the item. For example, they might think that could have been my cotton bud or my coffee cup or my plastic bag. And having that greater personal connection therefore gives them a sense of greater personal agency. So they might be able to think that they can join a beach clean or drastically reduce the amount of plastic they use. And the One Less campaign has very brilliantly and astutely led to a huge amount of people making that very commitment. I think finally people are also concerned that their health is being affected quite rightly through microplastics getting into the system and disrupting hormones, which is clearly of great concern. By contrast, we at Blue Marine, whose focus is on overfishing, struggle in a sense to get the same shock value by showing what's happening at the sort of mass slaughter, if you wanted to put it that way, of fish in the ocean, because fishing is seen as normalized. I think if you see a lot of dead fish that have been fished, the poor creatures, note, have a verb for their demise, which you wouldn't use with the killing of other animals, that people fail to be particularly moved by that. Secondly, the call to action, again, is less simple for individuals. Of course, people can stop eating fish, as was proposed in the film Seaspiracy, but that was regarded as very controversial and could potentially damage the livelihoods of people whose employment relies on fishing. And then it's a strange message clearly to send to the 3 billion people who rely on fish as their main source of protein. So then there are questions around, well, should I eat different sort of fish? And the answer to that is clearly yes, but the nuance is complex to convey. And then there are issues around who is in charge of the ocean and who should be appealed to. If a member of the public wanted to, for example, write to their politician, they could of course do that, but could they in some way get it in touch with the regional fisheries management organizations? Well, absolutely not, because those organizations are notoriously opaque and unaccountable. So we at Blue Marine, instead of trying to kind of resist plastic as a call to action, have chosen to focus much more on the messaging around the ocean being the world's biggest carbon sink. And so we've created some digital materials, which I'll attempt to just play a tiny snip of, something called The Sea We Breathe, which attempts to focus on the beauty of the ocean, to engage children particularly, but all ages in it, but also understand its crucial role in regulating the climate. So in conclusion, I think that plastic is part of a whole kind of ecosystem of problems that are facing the ocean. There is no single action to restore the ocean to health. What we need is many multifaceted actions urgently and simultaneously. As NGOs, I totally agree that we need to work together, but at the same time, we don't all have to do the same thing. I think it's good that NGOs are tackling the problems in a whole range of different ways. Again, we're like a sort of ecosystem. I think plastic, rather than being resisted or kind of, you know, I don't think we should criticize the public for having leapt on plastic as an issue of concern, but rather draw them in via that concern into the fact that there are many other concerns in the ocean. So use it as a kind of gateway to understanding the other concerns. And most of all, I see plastic as being the visual embodiment of the human impact on nature. And in a way, if we can kind of use that to make people alarmed in ways that they maybe wouldn't be by hearing news items or understanding scientific papers, that we use those visual images to arrest people and make them realize that we're at a crisis point, then maybe plastic has, in a strange way, served a very important purpose. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Claire, for making somehow a very good intro to my presentation. So the presentation somehow resonates with the general message of Claire's presentation. So plastics discourse as a catalyst for bigger initiative to save the ocean. So I think the fundamental question that this session is trying to explore is whether the attention on ocean plastics is diverting us from the more pressing ocean threats, more particularly climate change and overfishing. From our experience, our response to that fundamental question is a big no. How should I jump to the next slide?
Just use your down arrow.
Okay. Again, our response is a resounding no. Why? Overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the biggest issues, we often struggle with how and where to start. So that's the relevance or the strategic importance of the problem of plastics in the ocean. Ocean plastic provided COS4C with a viable place to start. It helped break down the big issues into bite-sized forms, to a level that actually can enable local or community-based actions. It catalyzed multi-stakeholder engagement, and essentially, based on what we have experienced in the Philippines, it creates a very important social capital for conservation. And as Claire has pointed out, it can create inroads for solving other key ocean issues. Our work with plastics, I can't describe that work elaborately here because of time limitation. You can visit the networks.com website. Actually provided the ground zero or starting point for what we do now as COS4C. To summarize what we have done as networks, we have collected or at least remove from the coastlines and fishing grounds around 300 tons, that should be equivalent to 300 million meters of discarded fishing nets from the coastlines. We have set up the first 8 very large MPAs in the Philippines. When I say very, very large, they are like 4,500 meters, 4,500% bigger than the average size of MPAs in the Philippines. Of course, we have also set up more than 100 self-help groups that can provide the social capital and the social platform for everything that we do on the ground. We need to revolutionize the way we should fund conservation, and our work in plastics provided the concept, or the starting concept for the work that we're doing now. The income that we're generating from waste plastic recycling is very inadequate. So it was very ambitious to aim that we would fund what we do using the income that we generate from plastic recycling. We needed an income center that can support our conservation initiatives in more sustainable manner. One that can free us up from the vicious cycle of boom and bust, which is associated with the dominant funding mode of traditional grants, so grants and philanthropy. This realization led us to the concept of diversifying into what we now call regenerative seaweed farming. The diversification is not only driven by income motive, it links with other efforts to find alternatives to petrochemical-based plastics, ensure food security, and enhance resilience of vulnerable coastal populations from the impacts of climate change. So that actually represents the first half of my presentation, and I would like to conclude the presentation by sharing with you a very recent short video on Coast for Sea.
So I wanted to talk about whether media attention can affect plastic pollution in the ocean. And I'll attempt to kind of run past why I think the media can make a difference. Plastic in the ocean, as Claire alluded to, has become the visible face of humankind's dying relationship with nature. And whether it's stories of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which at 600,000 square miles is now 3 times the size of France, whether it's stories of dead whales who've eaten plastic and have starved to death because of the plastic in their stomach, whether it's images of seals and other animals with plastic embedded in their flesh, they capture our attention and alert us to something is amiss. And one of the biggest turning points in our awareness of macroplastics in the ocean came in 2017, a while ago now, as a result of David Attenborough's Blue Planet 2 series, which was really a bit away from his previous wildlife documentaries, which just showed kind of animals living in the wild that looked at the challenges facing the ocean. 14 million viewers saw it. YouGov rated it the 4th most popular program of our time. And one of the world's foremost experts on marine plastic pollution, Professor Richard Thompson of Plymouth, said, in a few moments of coverage, Blue Planet 2 did more to raise awareness of plastic pollution than in my 20 years of research. And of course, scientific evidence gathering is incredibly important, but unless it's well communicated, it doesn't have that impact. Yes. So the Blue Planet effect had, as we've spoken and other speakers have spoken about, had an effect to a certain extent, where people had their awareness was raised about plastic pollution. But long before Blue Planet 2, newspapers had been publishing stories about plastic for years, and studies for years. The Daily Mail in 2008 first campaigned for a plastic bag ban in 2008. It was introduced in 2015, and in 2015, some 7.6 plastic bags were sold. By the year 2019, that was reduced by 95%. So it had some reduction in, obviously, the amount of just plastic bags that the UK was pushing into the ocean. The role of journalists really is to inform, to hold the powerful to account, and sometimes to entertain. And these kind of stories, this one by my colleague Sandra Laville in 2021, it helps to do just that. It helps to look at what retailers, what industry is saying they're doing, whether they are saying what they said they were doing, and to report really on the change that's happening in real time, is what is actually going on out there. At the moment, we don't measure plastics in the sea, we don't measure microplastics, we don't measure macroplastics. So we have to compile this kind of information. And this next piece, a piece that we published also last year, is a really good example of the circularity of media attention. Now, I wrote a story in which we were talking about Britain's exports of plastic waste to developing countries, something that's been going on for a long time. Boris Johnson promised to stop it. And I wrote about the increase in exports, the fact that exports weren't changing. A 9-year-old girl read this piece. She was prompted to act. She wrote a letter in her school. Then, along with her mother, she wrote a letter to Boris Johnson to stop sending plastic waste around the world. And she got 70,000 people to sign a petition. And then it prompted another story about it. We wrote another story about it. So this is the kind of circularity of media attention on an issue such as plastics. This piece here was about a spill of a container ship off the coast of Sri Lanka. And this actually, late last year, was one of the best read stories in The Guardian in 2021. It got 5 million page views. It was a big hit. We find that stories that get good engagement are environment stories. Readers share them a lot, they engage with them a lot, and it's one of the reasons that people come to The Guardian. But if we dig a little bit deeper on this particular story, we can interrogate a little bit more about what's going on. Now, at The Guardian, we can analyse attention span as well as analysing how many readers are reading something, and by analysing how long readers stay on the page. We do something called a clock system, and you get between 1 and 5 clocks, depending on how engaged a reader is. Now, unfortunately, this piece got 1 clock, to my disappointment. So that means that the readers stayed on the page only a fifth of the way through. While it got a massive audience, the audience didn't read it very far. Why is that? Is that because Sri Lanka, to the majority of our readers who are in the UK, the US and Europe, is very far away, although obviously we have readers all over the world? Is it because they just wanted to know, with that snappy headline, they just wanted to know what a nurdle is? And by the way, a nurdle is a very small unit of plastic that is used as a building block for all the plastic, other plastic substances that we have, from chair to everything else. We don't really know exactly why they clicked on that and didn't stay on it for very long. And one analysis of plastic images and stories by Brunel University quite recently found that, and Claire touched on this, found that this kind of disgust and shock doesn't necessarily equate to behavior change. It doesn't necessarily equate to people doing anything about it. People can suffer pollution fatigue. The study also found that combining these charismatic images of charismatic sea life with macro pollution might not be as effective. These issues are far from people's lives, how many people see seals or whales. But what did hit home for people was the idea that microplastics, which lack that visual spectacle, enter the food chain, the idea that they might eat fish that have got microplastics in their body. And this suggests that when content such as this aligns with the daily lives of people and their values, they care and they are prepared to make changes, like the plastic bag ban. They know that, they go to the supermarket and pick up a plastic bag or don't pick up a plastic bag, and that does make a difference. In the last 10 years, stories of microplastics have exploded. Research has exploded. Research has found that everywhere scientists look, they have found microplastics, from the deep ocean to the Arctic snow and ice, drinking water, everything from drinking water to beer, salt. One recent study has found that microplastics have transferred in the human placenta, which suggests that we are giving it to the next generation. We're passing it on to the next generation. And in writing stories like these, journalists like myself are always trying to find an angle that will hit home. How far has the plastic traveled? How damaging can it be to human health? How ubiquitous is this pollution? And how can I tell a story in a way that can engage people? And on to the good news. In February this year, world leaders agreed to draw up a historic plastic treaty. It was said by the head of UNEP, the UN Environment Programme, to be the most important multilateral treaty since the Paris Agreement. It will cover the full life cycle of plastics production and disposal over the next 2 years. And obviously the work is yet to be done. The work is in the next 2 years and getting them to sign up. And when I asked Inger Andersen, the head of UNEP, about pushback from chemical companies, she told me that 90 CEOs, including companies like PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, two of the world's largest producers of marine litter, had called for a binding treaty. Do you know why? She said, because all that public revulsion, all the entangled animals, and the concern over microplastics that consumers have, that has found its way up the business food chain to directors and CEOs. Public pressure, that's where the levers are, she said. While no targets have been set yet, we will be watching this treaty and reporting on the process. 9-year-old girls will be watching this, reporting on the process, and people will be reading it and writing letters to prime ministers, and the list goes on. We will continue to look for stories that surprise, shock and inform, but also that hold government and hold industry to account. So perhaps my Nerdle story, which was read by 5 million people, but who only read it a fifth of the way through, wasn't so pointless after all. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks for the invitation. I'll give a very brief overview of some of our recent work on plastic pollution and human behavior. To start with, I want to point out a few things that are the basis for our work. One is that we treat plastic pollution as a result of a plastic system, so there's no one actor that can resolve the problem. We need to work together. We need joined up solutions. Within this system, decisions and behaviors are central, and not just of the general public, but of all actors, from retailers to policymakers to designers and so on. But these decisions and behaviors are, of course, constrained by the existing system. What do we know about decisions and behaviors? We know an awful lot about their drivers, their triggers, and just focusing on psychological factors for now, here's a list of things that are established in the literature They range from emotions to values to social norms. Information and knowledge as a driver is a bit more debated, because knowledge on its own is not as powerful as many people think. So with that short preamble, I want to show you two examples, actually 3 examples of our current research. The first example is where we look at the concept of ocean connectedness. This is where people feel subjectively close, emotionally affiliated with the ocean. And we measured this and then distinguished between those people who are high versus those who are low in ocean connectedness. We related this to their purchasing decisions, specifically willingness to pay for single-use plastic bottles. What you can see in this graph is that when people are low in ocean connectedness, it doesn't matter to them whether the bottle is recyclable or not. On the left-hand side, when they're high in ocean connectedness, it matters a lot. They really prefer to buy single-use bottles that are recyclable, and they really don't like non-recyclable bottles. So a link between this psychological concept of ocean connectedness and the decision people make. Second example I want to show you is where we relate marine impacts to the decision point. In this case, it's the disposal point. So we were able to run a large field experiment in an office building in Vancouver. And we compared different signage in the building. I'm only showing you the successful signage here, which was exactly that, talking about marine impact. So the classic pictures of the turtle with the plastic bag. On the floors where people saw this signage, they reduced their plastic use based on the analysis of bins. So we looked at items there. So it's quite exciting. So far, the examples I've shown you are global north, so Canada, UK. It's really important as well to look at different contexts. And we've run a couple of studies in the global south as part of the Blue Communities project. Here in this example, we asked a community of 430 people on an island, Palau in the Philippines, to give us their thoughts on trends in environmental problems. So we asked them about different things. I've highlighted here the amount of plastic, and what they're telling us, the little black bar, is that they think plastic now is worse, plastic pollution is worse than it was 10 years ago, and the little gray bar is it will be worse in 10 years' time. It's not a huge negative trend, but it's definitely negative compared to all the other issues. There are 3 other issues that are worse in their mind, that relates to shellfish and wild fish and to sewage. And these are largely poor people who rely on fish for their livelihood. So this is looming larger. We also see some positive developments here. The final thing I wanted to show you briefly is a new project we recently started called Pisces. This focuses on the Indonesian context where lots of things are happening, really positive developments, and we're working with local partners and with the government there to make a change to plastic pollution. Again, our work package focuses on social and behavioral drivers. So keep your eyes open for results coming from that. I've got a few key messages here on the last slide. So to me, human decisions and behaviors are absolutely core to resolve plastic pollution. And we can use psychological and social theory, use those factors to explain decisions and behaviors and inform interventions. It doesn't mean that it's the fault or the responsibility of individual consumers. It just means it's part of the picture. And interventions need to be evaluated. And we need to work together and share the responsibility. And that's a thank you to all the great people I work with. Thanks.